Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Today I'm joined by David Lawday, the author of A Time in Paris, a historical novel set during the Siege of Paris of 1870 and the subsequent Paris Commune. And here we are to discuss really the history of that turbulent period and the characters involved, notably the French Emperor Napoleon III and the Chancellor of Prussia and then of Imperial Germany, Otto von Bismarck, and the legacy of the Paris Commune. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to David, and let's talk now about Paris in 1870.
Okay, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Now, I'm joined today by David Lawday, who has written a historical novel set during the Siege of Paris of 1870, the product of the kind of disastrous failure of France to defend itself against Prussian invasion, largely the product of Napoleon III's sort of failed saber-rattling diplomacy with Bismarck. But we're going to talk to David now a bit about the book. It's a sort of historical novel set during that period. A little bit about the research and a bit about the significance of that period of time. So firstly, welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Hello.
Okay, David, perhaps you can tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about the book and the process of researching and writing it. Where did the idea come from to set it's actually, I don't know about the fiction of that period, but it's a kind of a great concept. Tell us about the writing and the research of the book.
Well, for me, it followed on from some books that I'd written before about French history. And the two main ones were historical biographies. One was of Talleyrand, who was the right-hand man of Napoleon, and who finally decided that Napoleon was mad for conquest and contributed to bringing him down. The other one was about Danton. It's called The Giant of the French Revolution. And so both the books that which puts him in conflict with Robespierre, the known conflict that was there. So both of those led me on to thinking more about what was going to happen as a result of the revolution after Napoleon. There was the restoration of the monarchy. And then finally, Napoleon III comes to power, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and does some fairly remarkable things, but also becomes very unpopular. First of all, he came to power through a coup, which always counted against him, especially with the French elite, starting with Victor Hugo. And so I came to the Siege of Paris because it was the most extraordinary moment for the city. I live in Paris. I'm talking to you from Paris, and it's quite difficult to remember that this city, until fairly recently, was actually surrounded by very tall ramparts, completely surrounded, which is why we have the gates today, the porte, as they call them.
Was it the kind of the transformation of Paris by Baron Haussmann that removed all of that, or was that some other reason? The removal of the ramparts.
No, the ramparts were here. Baron Haussmann didn't interfere with the rampart.
No,
he left them up. I'm not sure why, except that since part of the reason that Napoleon III wanted Haussmann to completely reconfigure Paris was that it would be easier for him to suppress the mob should the occasion arise.
These lovely, gigantic, great boulevards that you can't build barricades down.
Yeah, right, exactly. So my interest in France comes from quite a long way back, from school, really. I had a wonderful, inspiring French master who had quite a limp. And we all thought he'd been he was an agent during the war with the resistance, and he was English, but that he'd been parachuted into France and broken his leg and this sort of thing. But he was a wonderful man, and he was a mentor for me too. And as a result of that, really, I then went to university, studied French at Oxford. So I'm a Francophile, I'm an unabashed Francophile. I live in Paris, as I say. I married a French woman, which is a nice thing to do for an Englishman. And so my writing about France really comes from all these things.
Yeah,
it does. There happens to be a wonderful library, national library here now, which is fairly new, the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is the greatest place on earth for people researching anything about France. You can bring up any sort of manuscripts, books, in about a half an hour from 1750 or so onwards.
Wow.
I spent quite a lot of time there. It's in Paris. Yeah.
There are certain places, I mean, Berlin is another example of this, where obviously the physical geography of the city is suffused with its history, and it's almost as if the kind of the past speaks to you from the pavements almost. And in Paris, you do get that feeling about the place. Perhaps more so even than London, and maybe it's because of the sorts of the revolutionary transformations that Paris has had, and the several kind of sieges and invasions that there have been. But anyway, tell us a little bit about the book. It's obviously set during the siege. What occurs? Tell us the story.
Well, the background. This is actually a love story that takes place, that evolves during the siege of Paris, when everybody is trapped. Population of 2 million people. Biggest city in the world at the time, and everyone is trapped within the city. And the reason, the spark for the war is almost unbelievably trivial. What happened was that the throne of Spain was vacant. Queen Isabella had been ousted. The throne was looking for someone new to sit on it. And Prussia, with King Wilhelm of the Hohenzollern dynasty, decided to put a candidate forward, a prince of the Hohenzollern line. This raised quite a hue and cry around the capitals of Europe. They thought it was a bit much that Prussia would go that far. And he withdrew the candidature. Meanwhile, Napoleon III was sort of spoiling for a fight with Prussia anyway. Decided that this was not enough for him to informally renounce this claim to the Spanish throne, and demanded of Wilhelm that he formally renounce all claim to the Spanish throne forever. Wilhelm took the demand quite courteously, but said, look, I think I've already done enough on this. I've made it public that I've withdrawn the candidature. And so as far as I'm concerned, that's that.
Hmm.
Bismarck, back in Berlin, gets hold of this meeting where this takes place between the French ambassador and Wilhelm, gets hold of a telegram explaining what had happened, and turns it by crossing things out here and never adding anything, but just putting in commas, as the Germans love to do, and turned it into a moment that was a great insult, an unforgivable insult to Prussia, and a humiliating come down for Napoleon III. Napoleon III took this as Bismarck expected, took this as an impossible affront and declared war three days later.
Yeah,
that was the actual spark for the war. The real reason, of course, for the war was that the question of German unification.
Mm-hmm.
Bismarck had calculated that this was his life's ambition, his life's work, unifying Germany, which of course was mainly Prussia, but a host of sovereign kingdoms and duchies and bishoprics, and his life's work was to unify Germany. And he recognized that unless Prussia defeated France, this would never come about.
No.
Why would it never come about? Because Napoleon III had become a kind of, not a mentor really, but a sort of self-styled protector of the South German states, Bavaria, etc., which Bismarck had to bring in to this unified Germany. And so this couldn't happen unless France was defeated and no longer stood in the way of unification. 3 days after this meeting, after the declaration of war, they went to battle out in the eastern France, the Rhineland, and there was some pretty bloody fighting that went on over July and August. There were a huge amount of casualties until suddenly, and it seemed to be a bit of a standoff. There was no result came from these battles until one day, early in September, the French Imperial Army collapsed at Sedan. And at Sedan, not only the entire Imperial Army was captured, but Napoleon III himself was taken prisoner, and they were shipped off to Germany, where they were no longer any problem. At that point, Bismarck also knew that to defeat France, you didn't just defeat an army, you had to capture Paris. You had to take control of Paris, take charge of Paris. That had always been the case. People had captured Paris before through history. There was even one of our kings, Henry the Fourth, was it?
One of them, anyway.
Right. Right. That goes a bit far back for me. And so the victorious Prussian army descended on Paris. Didn't take long to get there. And by the 15th of September, they had totally encircled Paris with what was probably about 400,000 men came to, probably the largest siege army that ever took the field. They totally surrounded the capital. The commander of the German army, Helmut von Moltke, decided that it would not be a good thing. It would be very difficult to stage a direct attack, and that they would try to starve Paris out. So So all communications were cut. All supplies were stopped from coming into the capital. So Paris was literally entirely cut off from the world. This went on it was extremely hot Indian summer that year. This went on for a first month. The Parisians were fairly gung-ho about defending themselves. They'd totally broken with the Napoleon III and had declared a republic in Paris, which was sort of de facto, ipso facto, the Republic of France, as far as they were concerned, and went on to. I'm sorry about that interruption.
Sorry.
Went on to a second month, into a second month, into a third month, and they tried a few breakouts, but they didn't think that the breakouts were going to succeed, mainly because the military governor of Paris, whose name was General Louis Trochu, who was also the president of the Republic, thought that the Prussian soldiers were invincible. He didn't think that the defenders of Paris had a chance. The main force that he had at his disposal, he had maybe 70,000 real troops, but they were pretty demoralized by what had happened out on the front. He had some reservists and young men from the provinces, about 100,000 of those. But the main group of men in some kind of uniform at his disposal were members of what was called the National Guard, the Paris National Guard. These were the bakers and apprentices and barbers and
the dad's army,
bakers of Paris. This, the fathers and sons of Paris who signed up for £1.50 a day. They wanted to sign up, and there were 300,000 of them signed up. But Trochu decided that he couldn't possibly use them, put them into the field against the Prussians. They'd just get totally slaughtered, and they didn't know how to fight anyway. Half of them didn't have a full uniform, and they certainly didn't have rifles.
No.
So he sat tight, thinking that the only possible chance that Paris had of winning, of driving the Russians off, was that if the Prussians did actually try a direct assault. Then in the streets of Paris, who knows what might have happened. But they didn't. They did. They tried the Prussians stayed there against the advice of Bismarck, who was getting very, very impatient. He feared that unless this was done quickly, that Paris was captured quickly, that there would be intervention by the other European countries who didn't like to see Prussia gaining such supremacy. Particularly, he was worried about Britain coming out. And they didn't. They stayed neutral. In the end, they stayed neutral. Sorry?
Oh, no, I was... Yes.
Yeah. In the end, they stayed neutral. The siege went on into a fourth month, and Bismarck was getting more and more agitated about it. And he finally convinced von Moltke, the marshal, head of the Prussian forces, that he had to bring in the really big guns. They had a massive gun, which had been shown a couple of years before at the Universal Exhibition in Paris, made by the Krupp Company, which was the biggest gun that had ever been seen. And he convinced Moltke to bring these in from Germany. They were brought in by rail. The bombardment of Paris, which actually only reached, they bombarded from the south, it only reached the Ile de la Cité, the Seine. It didn't reach northern Paris. That but mainly hunger, brought about the capitulation of the city, which at the time had become a very divided place between it was quite a bourgeois capital, but with a very large working class population, with pretty strong revolutionary tendencies. And instead of this republic, they wanted to. Well, they were. The republic was fine, but they wanted it to be a revolutionary republic, and so this stew of things brought about the capitulation. After into the 5th month.
Yeah.
So at that time, Paris was truly famished.
It's interesting to think, isn't it? Because what follows is the Paris Commune, and this very brief kind of revolutionary government, which is suppressed by the Third Republic, and revolutionaries for the next 100 years, and sort of anti-revolutionary figures for the next 100 years, drew all sorts of lessons from the Paris Commune. It's in the writings of Lenin and Stalin. It's all, and Mao. They constantly refer to it about what the communards did wrong and what they should have done and what we're going to do. And Hitler said, something like the Paris Commune, you can't have things like that. The common man getting ideas above his station. That's something you must never. It would have been better if the Prussians had razed Paris to the ground than let that kind of thing spread. So,
absolutely, I just would add, as for back up what you said, as for Lenin, he did take inspiration from the Commune, Paris, the second Commune. This was not because of how to successfully, obviously, carry out a revolution, but from what you learned about what to avoid, how not to carry out a revolution.
Yeah. And I think the lessons he drew were be utterly merciless with your class enemies. Take them out and shoot them, because that's what they will do to you. And probably some other observations too, but I think that was the key one. So you have this moment, which is relatively short-lived in time. You have, prior to that, a siege which lasts for five months, which, when you're under siege, that's a very long time if you're surrounded by an army. But it's interesting how those sorts of hardships, famines, take revolutionary ideas that have probably been there for a long, long time, and suddenly blast those into the kind of into the center of that historical moment. If you look at Petrograd in 1917, there had been kind of revolutionary ideas in Russia for half a century, but there aren't really, in Petrograd in 1917, there aren't actually particularly any revolutionaries of note there. It's just this simply spontaneous outpouring of public anger that morphs into a revolution. And I wonder whether revolutions are always part accident. They are part historical kind of chaos, as opposed to sort of some kind of master plan.
Well, I think in the case of Paris in 1870, it wasn't an accident. It was coming anyway. There was great dissatisfaction with Napoleon III. It was rather lucky for the revolutionary movement in Paris that he was beaten, that he was ousted in that sense. They were held back by this sort of division in the city. I say it was a divided city. It was generally regarded as a bourgeois city, but there were the rumbling. They were already the revolutionary element were already known as the Reds, les Rouges, in Paris before the siege started. So this had been coming in this case.
The Parisian bourgeoisie had done very nicely out of the Napoleon III kind of era, hadn't they? It had been quite a glorious time if you had a bit of money. But I think, I mean, Napoleon III himself is one of the kind of the more fascinating characters of mid-19th century Europe, because he has this kind of, famous or infamous family connection. He is a kind of, I suppose you could call a populist figure in the way that we might understand it now. Quite a chancer. And at times, as a younger man, part of various revolutionary circles like the Carbonari in Italy. And also this sort of kind of cunning opportunist, and he sort of, to my mind, doesn't quite fit with lots of the other kind of major figures that you see during the time. He's sort of quite anomalous. But what do you make of him?
We're talking about Napoleon III, right?
The third, yes.
Napoleon III. He had done a lot of fairly impressive things. The Suez Canal really was due to him, building of the Suez Canal. The unification of Italy, which he more than supported. He supported it with troops. He had so he was a pretty big figure in Europe, and as you say, the economy had done fairly well as a result of his the good things that he'd done, and so the bourgeoisie in Paris were pretty happy with him on the whole. Again, in this group of people, this large group of people, what we're calling the bourgeoisie, there were those who never forgave him because he came to power by a coup d'état. He actually, first of all, became president, and then became emperor through a coup d'état. And people, the intelligentsia in Paris never forgave him for that. First of all, Victor Hugo, who exiled himself and sort of threw literary bombs at him from the Channel Islands over the next 15 years or so. So he was an ambiguous figure, but when he was ousted, he clearly wasn't very much missed.
No.
What happened when the really horrific thing that happened, which we were referring to just now, after the Commune, the Commune was bloodily suppressed by a new government in France, which took over from the Republican ministers. On the capitulation in Paris, they abandoned the government, and elections were called, which Bismarck thought was a good thing to do. And a new government was formed, and it was a very conservative government. And it sat in Bordeaux, first of all, because they thought it would not be safe to sit the deputies in Paris. And it would not have been. And gradually, the man in charge of that, of course, was Thiers, who was not a totally conservative character, but the government that he formed had to be very conservative. It was made up of country squires, basically. As they called them in Paris, it was a country bumpkin government. And he formed an army, and to gain the Commune in Paris, of course, was an obstacle to a new French government having power, because the Commune thought of itself as the power in France. He brought up an army to Versailles, quite big in the end, and attacked the Commune in a way that the Prussians had always refused to do. They broke through. They broke through the walls of Paris. They broke through the gates, came swarming in from western Paris, and there was the fighting with the Reds, which resulted in a lot of wonderful monuments being burnt, mainly the old Hôtel de Ville, which is a beautiful medieval building that was burnt to the ground. The palace, the royal palace, although it wasn't totally destroyed, but it was largely destroyed. And it was a terrible moment, because once the new government under Thiers had gained control, they started slaughtering the Reds. And the estimates are that anything up to about 30,000 of the revolutionaries, the members of the Commune, were slaughtered in this.
Yes.
And so this was sort of incredible ordeal upon an ordeal that Paris had already been through. So it was really a horrific moment in French history. Yeah,
and it's one of the, again, coming back to the lessons that Lenin learned. It was during the Russian Civil War. He said, "Well, that's what will happen to us if we allow counter-revolutionaries to prevail." Now we draw to a close in a moment, but am I to imagine that the book is currently available in all good bookshops? Is it published at the moment, or is it awaiting a
Yes, it's published. I'm not sure whether all good bookshops have it. I hope that Daunt's, for example, does. It's certainly available. It's certainly available on the internet.
It is a Time in Paris by David Lawday. Just a word to the listeners. Please, if you can, do try to support your independent bookshops. They really need your help. So please, if you can, if you're going to buy the book, please get it from an independent retailer. So my public service announcement for the day. So, David, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And
let me just add one thing, by the way.
Oh, please do.
If I may, because the consequences of this are argued over, but the consequences were pretty significant, because France never, as Victor Hugo predicted, France would never sleep until it got its own back from that. It lost its precious provinces in the east, Lorraine and Alsace, to Germany, and indeed it never did. The spirit of getting our own back was always there, which led inexorably to the First World War, thus hence to the Second. And as you were saying, there was a certain amount of inspiration taken from all this by Lenin, thus the Russian Revolution. But this is just to take it all forward and to give some kind of idea of what I think is the significance of what happened in this book.
I think there's a very famous quote by Disraeli just after the Franco-Prussian War, where he said essentially this kind of diplomatic or kind of geopolitical revolution had happened, and he said, and the main victim of it all is Great Britain, which is but perhaps a difficult one to maintain, because basically there's a whopping great German empire on the continent now, and our old policies of divide and rule, perfidious Albion and all that, are going to come up against a really significant power. And centuries of Anglo-French animosity by the kind of the 1890s, just 20 years later, are reversed with all sorts of rapprochements. And then in 1904, you have this entente cordiale. And so it makes these sorts of things make strange friends from time to time. Anyway, there we must finish. But it's been a pleasure to talk with you. And I would, if you're willing to come back on the podcast at some point to talk more about Paris, it would be my pleasure to talk about it.
That's kind of you. I certainly will.
Thanks so much. Have yourself a great day. And thanks so much for coming on the podcast.